Okay, didn't they just make your heart glad? Just all those kids up there reciting that verse. If you're not sure what's kind of going on, we began this brand new series in the beginning of the summer called Whatever, and we're looking at the book of Philippians, which is Paul's letter to the church of Philippi. And the verse that the kids recited, the very first week we started this series, Philippians chapter 4, verse 8 through 9, the entire church was challenged to memorize it. So just watching those kids say that this week just made my heart happy. You know what will make my heart even happier? Next week, our last week of the series, the last week of the whole study of the book of Philippians, to hear you recite that by memory, okay? So it was funny. I was kind of looking out there on the side of my eyes as they were saying it, and I saw some of you look anxious and nervous. I don't think you were so anxious and nervous about the kids messing up. You're thinking, what if Pastor Keith calls on me next week and I have to say this out loud? So here's the deal. If you promise to memorize it, to be able to recite it from memory, I will not call on you and point you out next week. So I'll know when we come to church, if you walk up and shake my hand with great confidence, that means you know it. If you duck your head and try to walk around me, that will be my cue that you don't know the verse, and who knows what the Holy Spirit might lead me to do in this service, okay? So there you go right there. It has really been a great summer series. Like I said, in the very beginning of the summer, we started this whole book of Philippians, and I've read this book of Philippians. I think I've studied the book of Philippians before, but not until the summer that I just really dove into it. And I don't know about you, but it has been good for my life. You know, we talked about in the study of the book of Philippians that God wants us to find joy. In fact, the Apostle Paul, as he wrote this letter to the church of Philippi, he used the word joy maybe over 20 different times. And his whole purpose of writing the letter to his friends was to help them rediscover and to really experience the joy that God created them to find in their own lives. And we've talked about finding joy in relationships. We've talked about finding joy in your circumstances, in our attitude. We talked about finding joy at work. We talked about finding joy in our spiritual life. And then last week, Grant was here, and I was out of town, but he preached finding joy in your future. And so we have 2 more weeks, this week and next week, as we finish up the study of the book of Philippians. And I like to think of the book, as we said, a letter, but each chapter, I like to think of it as a different page. And so if we're on the 4th chapter of the 4 chapters of Philippians, we're on the last page of Paul's letter. And I think what Paul's doing in this last page of this letter is he's just really writing just about several different things. Instead of taking one topic and taking 10 or 15 verses to cover it, he's just like, okay, I've got to put this in here, and I've got to put this in there, and I've got to put this in there. So as we open up chapter 4, here's what the Apostle Paul is writing to his friends in the church of Philippi, but I think he's writing to us here at South Sub also. There's a couple of ladies in the church, and we're not really sure what happened, but a couple of ladies in the church of Philippi, they got in a little catfight. They got in a little argument, and so there's conflict going on between them. And so Paul writes just a few verses in there telling these ladies they need to clarify, they need to reconcile, they need to fix this conflict that's going on. And I think Paul may be one of the wisest men I've ever known in my life or read about in my whole life, because he waited till he almost was done with the letter before bringing up these ladies need to clear up this conflict, okay? Had he started in chapter 1 or verse 1 of that first page, it might not have turned out so well. But he's like, hey, by the way, before we finish this letter, let me just let you know. And he actually called the ladies out by name. Can you imagine? One of the little squabbles, fights, disagreements you got into, and 2,000 years later, people are still writing and reading about your fight. Wouldn't that be kind of embarrassing? So if you will, look with me in chapter 4, verse 1 through 4, and here's a little bit about the fight, this conflict going on between these 2 ladies. Paul wrote, therefore, my brothers and sisters, you whom I love and I long for, my joy and my crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way, dear friends. And then he goes on to verse 2. He says, I plead with Yoda, that's out of Star Wars. This is actually Eudio and Syntyche to be the same mind of the Lord. And then he says this, yes, and I ask you, my true companion, help these women since they have contended at my side at the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. So again, we're not really sure what the conflict was going on, but here's some things I pick up as he writes those first few verses. First of all, we need to understand that conflict is natural. Okay? If you're in relationship with somebody, whether it's here at church, you're in relationship with somebody who lives in your home, you're in relationship with somebody that you work with, your neighbors with, anytime you're in a relationship with people, that conflict is a natural part of that relationship. I grew up in a family that I used to always say was kind of the leave it to beaver family. Like, we never fought, okay? Just somehow we always got along. And then when I got married, all of a sudden this thing called conflict came into my life. And in the form of my wife's name's Denise. And so conflict, not that she was the conflict, but us trying to take two lives and bring them together. And at first it scared me to death. I'm thinking, what's wrong with us? Because I grew up in this family that very rarely ever had conflict. But after 30 years of marriage, 30 years of raising kids, 30 years of being in the professional life of ministry and professional life of just all around work, here's what I realized. You cannot avoid conflict. And even Paul, as he writes about this lady's conflict, he's saying, hey, we need to clarify and fix this, but he didn't condemn the ladies for it, because I think Paul understood that is just a natural part of life. But as he writes about that, here's the deal we need to understand, is that unresolved conflict can be very destructive. That Paul had his eyes on one thing, and that is sharing the gospel. And so in these first few verses, he even called on a friend, Clement. He said, can you step in and help these two ladies clarify, fix, reconcile this conflict? Because we have more important things to do than fight with one another. We have the gospel of Jesus Christ that we have to get out there. And so today, I just want to give us all just kind of a breather. If you've experienced conflict this past week, in fact, let's just do this. Anybody experienced any kind of conflict this past week? Yeah, okay, look around, okay? Don't be left alone there. Here's a fun one. Anybody experienced conflict this weekend? Okay, narrowed it down a little bit. Here's a really fun one. Anybody experienced conflict on your way to church this morning? Yeah. For some of us, we're still raising our hand, aren't we? That's exactly right. So conflict is natural, and Paul is just going, take a breath. Don't think of yourself as a bad Christian. Don't think of yourself as a follower of Jesus who's not doing right. Conflict is normal, but you have to be able to deal with it and reconcile through that conflict. And then what Paul does next, I think, is very interesting. Remember I said he's finishing up his letter? And over the next few verses, he just starts writing just a few more just thoughts that he has on different things. And I think as I studied this last letter, this last chapter, he wasn't specifically writing over, and here's the 5 steps for reconciling relationships, but yet he was giving such wisdom. As I study this last passage, I can tell that if we lay the wisdom that he gives us on top of conflict, it actually leads us to reconcile in a very healthy way relationships that have conflict. And here's what I want us to go today, and here's where I want us to end. I want us to end by realizing this. We can find joy in conflict. Let me say that again, because that's so foreign to us, okay? Conflict doesn't bring you joy, but when you reconcile the conflict in godly manner, it actually does bring you joy. And so let me just walk you through these verses in here. Like I said, I'm not sure when Paul was writing them, he was going, here's step 1 for reconciling conflict. Here's step 2. Yet the wisdom that we find in the words that he shares with both the church of Philippi and the church of South Sub actually leads us to find joy in reconciling relationships. So if you have your notes, you can write these down. Here's the first one: healthy practices for conflict resolution. Now, before I give you the first one, let me just, so you'll know I'm on the same page with you. Remember I said that I didn't have conflict growing up and then I got married? It took me about a week to find conflict in my marriage, okay? Or maybe Denise would say it another way. It took her about a week to find me, which led her to conflict in our marriage. We were coming back from our honeymoon. We had, while we were gone, my brothers and my father set all of our stuff and put it in our new apartment that we were going to move in together once we got married. And so we were looking forward to setting up our household together. And I remember on the flight home that we were making a list of all the different things that we need to buy. You know, the things that you don't normally think of that set up a house. We need the Ajax. We need the soap. We need the trash can. We need the trash can liners. We need the hangers. All this list of things you don't think about once you've been living someplace for many, many years. And by the time on our plane ride back, we had finished our list. It was 2 pages long. But we finished this list and we said, just think, we'll go to Target. And this is our first trip to Target. And so we got back from our honeymoon. We went to Target. It was the most romantic shopping trip I'd ever taken on my life. Because here we were, 2 newlyweds, not even been married 1 week yet. And we had this list. And here's how the shopping trip went. We'd go down the first aisle going, there's the Ajax. And we'd take Ajax, put it in the cart, and look at each other going, I love you, and kiss each other. We'd go down the aisle a little bit further, and we'd find the next thing on there. Oh, look, this is so sweet. Here's our first bar of ivory soap, put in, oh, I love you. And we kept doing that. And I realized, like, this is very romantic, but it's going to take forever to ever get back home. And so after about 2 or 3 hours, I said, hey, babe, why don't we do this? There's 2 pages of this list. Why don't you take one, take this card. I'll go get another card. I'll take it, and we'll meet back and pay for it and get back to the house. She goes, oh, that sounds good. She looked at me, and she probably thought, you're the best thing in the whole wide world. I'm sure she thought that anyway. So we kissed each other. We went our separate ways. We filled it up. We met back to pay for it. Her cart was full. My cart was full. And as we're pushing to go pay for it, I looked in her cart, and I noticed something that was in there that was not on the list. She had in there, and I've shared this story with some of you when I was interviewing, she had in that cart yellow fuzzy toilet seat covers. Okay, I knew for a fact yellow fuzzy toilet seat covers were not on the list because I grew up with all boys, okay, all brothers in the house. You don't have fuzzy toilet seat covers because they'd always fall down at the wrong time. You know what I'm talking about? And so I knew that wasn't on there, and I said, oh, babe, what's that? And I was expecting her to say, oh, that's my mistake. Let me put it back up. But that's not what she said that day. She goes, oh, those are our yellow fuzzy toilet seat covers. I said, but they weren't on our list. And she goes, oh, but they were on my list. That was my first step into real marriage right at that point, right? And so I said, well, you know, we don't need those. We won't have those in our house. And she looked at me. She says, oh, no, we will have those in my house. Yes, we will. I'm embarrassed to say, but our first fight, 5 days, 6, 7 days into our marriage, it turned into such a, I want to say squabble because that sounds more gentle, fight. By the time we finished discussing right there, we left both buggies full of stuff, and we went to the car not talking to one another. We didn't pay for it. We were so mad. I'm going, no, we're not going to have yellow fuzzy toilet seat covers. We get in the car. I drive her back to our apartment. I said, I just need to go get some air. You should go in. And I drove straight to my dad's house because I knew my father knew how to run a household, and I was ready to go to my dad, explain the situation. He'd say, you march right back, and you tell her how the Smith family works. And I'll never forget. Went into my house. Dad, you'll never guess. I told him the story, and he said, you need to do the right thing, son. I said, I know. What should I say to her? He said, no, you need to go back to Target and get those yellow fuzzy toilet seat covers is what you need to do. Again, I think to myself, can I imagine 2,000 years later, somebody writes mine and Denise's name down and talking about that fight? So you can laugh at me, but I guarantee you I could bring up some kind of conflict with somebody you've had in your life, and it will be as silly and as ridiculous as that. So let's see what the Apostle Paul says. How do we go about handling conflict when it occurs? A healthy approach to reconciling. And the first one I say is this, and you can write this in your notes. It needs to respond gently. A healthy step in reconciling conflict in a relationship is you need to learn to respond gently. Look at Philippians chapter 4, verse 5. Paul said it very clearly for us. Let your gentleness be evident to all. I have a firm belief that most conflict is not about the conflict, but it's about the response to the conflict. Let me say that again. Most conflict in our life is not about the actual conflict. It's about the response to the conflict that led to more conflict. If you think back to most conflict you've had in your life, and I'm like, what is it? You probably can't even pinpoint what it was, but you can pinpoint that you said something in a way, or she said something in a way, or he said something in a way, in a tone or a manner that you didn't like, so you said something back, and they said something back, and it just kept escalating and escalating because of the response back to it. And Paul's going, if you want to find joy in conflict, again, that's so foreign because we don't think conflict brings joy. But when we handle the reconciliation in a godly manner, it can bring joy. He says the first step is that you have to respond gently. Proverbs 15:1 says this, a gentle response diffuses anger, but a sharp tongue kindles a temper fire. In Philippians 4:5, let your gentleness be evident to all. So first of all, you got to respond gently. Here's the second thing. You need to include Jesus in the conversation. Now, here's most of us. When conflict occurs, it's me versus you, you versus me. And we quickly leave Jesus out of it. Now, I do pretty good most of the time when it comes to conflict resolution, whether it's in relationships at home or at work, maybe because I'm a pastor, I've learned. But if there's some kind of discussion, things start rising, I've learned just to kind of like, okay, let me just kind of de-escalate this and do the right way until I have some kind of conflict on the phone with a customer service agent that has no idea that I'm a pastor. And I'm going to confess to you right now that I think I hold it in so long trying to be the good Christian, answer this way and be gentle and be nice and always think of Jesus being there. When I'm on the phone with customer service and they've done something I don't like or haven't fixed something the way I think they should, it's almost like I put the receiver down and going, hey, Jesus, could you go next door and have some coffee and pie for a second because I'm going to handle this one all by myself. It's just my confession because just mentally, I just kind of check Jesus out of the conversation. And here's what I know. The minute I kind of move Jesus to the side, I begin treating and speaking to that individual in a way that's not becoming to me being a follower of Jesus. It's when Jesus is near that I got to think, not that I just keep it under control because that's the good thing to do. I keep it under control because that's the godly thing to do. Philippians 4, chapter 5 says this, the Lord is near. Would I speak in that tone if Jesus was right here? Would I respond to you in that way if Jesus was right here with us? If this wasn't just a two-way conversation, but it was a three-way conversation, and Jesus was in the center of it, how would I interact with it? I said there's so many different types of conflict that we have. But if you're married, you know over the course of years, there's a certain amount of conflict that comes being married to somebody. When I forget that Jesus is near, and I start looking at Denise as, and I hate to say this, but there's many times in our marriage, as the enemy. You ever done that before? That whoever you're going against is like, I got to win, I got to fight, I got to beat you, and they become the enemy. And I forget that my wife is not only my wife, she's a daughter of Jesus. She's a sister in Christ. She's part of the family. And when I put Jesus out, I forget all those other roles that she holds. But it's not just my wife, it's my neighbor, it's my coworkers, it's other family members that don't live with me. But when I remember that Jesus is near, that helps me keep things in perspective. Philippians chapter 2, verse 4 through 5 says this, and this was Paul talking earlier in his letter. He said, but in humility, think more of each other than you do of yourselves. None of you should think only of his own affairs, but you should learn to see things from other people's point of view. And I know for me, when Jesus is near, when mentally I keep Jesus in the conversation, it helps me see things from the other person's perspective as much as it is mine. I wrote this down. It says this, healthy relationships are about unity and not uniformity. Let me say that again. It's not in your notes, but you may want to jot it down. Healthy relationships are about unity and not uniformity. When Paul was writing to Clement to help these two ladies get things together, he didn't say, hey, Clement, make them think exactly the same way. Make them talk and repeat the same things you want them to say. No, he says, just bring them together. I learned a long time ago in my marriage that Denise does not have to be like me to be with me. Early in our marriage, I would fight so much to get her to think like I think and respond the way I respond and do the things that I want her to do. And all of a sudden I realized I was taking Denise out of the equation and I was just trying to marry another Keith. But yet I thought if we're one, and it finally dawned on me that I need to allow Denise to be fully Denise and Keith to be fully Keith, and us come together in unity, not uniformity. Most conflict that we have with people, whether it's in marriage or friendships or work or wherever it is because we're wanting the other person to think, do, and feel exactly like we think, do, and feel. It's about unity and not uniformity. And so bring Jesus in there to help you bring that unity together. Here's the third one. This one sounds kind of strange. Let me say it and I'll kind of break it down for you. I think the third thing that Paul would advise us as we're trying to find joy in our conflict is this. Don't write your own story. Don't write your own story. Here's what happens beginning of conflict. We have frustration about something or somebody. Somebody at work comes along and says, hey, how's the timeline going on that new project you've been working on? So they say something, and whatever it is, it triggers some kind of frustration within us. And from that frustration, we become anxious, and we begin wondering, what are they thinking? What are they doing? And so we just get nervous and antsy. So from frustration to anxiousness, that leads us to telling a story and figuring out the story in our own mind. And we just try to figure out the conversation. Let me go back. Somebody walks up to you going, you're at work going, hey, how's the timeline? How are you doing on that timeline on that project? And all of a sudden you're going in your mind, wait a second. It's not even due until next Friday. Are they questioning my work ethic? Are they thinking I'm not working hard? And why is that person even asking me? They don't even work in my same group over here. Did my boss send them over here to ask that question? Does my boss not think I work good? And all of a sudden we begin having all these conversations in our head, pretend conversations. Why? Because someone said something that frustrated us, that led to us having some anxious feelings, and therefore we start writing this story in our head. And here's what I've learned about writing stories in our head. We always make ourselves the heroes of our stories. I never make up a story. I never have these internal conversations where I make you the hero, because that wouldn't work good for my life. It's my internal conversations. It's me writing my own story that allows me to step back and be okay with me because I feel anxious about something that you said. Are you following me? And these internal conversations happen within family units. They happen within the work units. They happen with neighborhoods. They happen in churches. And all of a sudden, we start writing the own stories, and somehow in the stories, the conflict gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's a greater chasm between me and the other person as I write the story. Philippians chapter 4, verse 6 and 7, Paul's giving us more advice, and here's what he says about it. He says, do not be anxious about anything, but instead, in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Jesus Christ. So Paul's going, instead of writing your own story, this make-believe story in your mind, why don't you just go to God and pray for and with that person? Wouldn't that be a better approach to it? I wonder, as you think about whatever conflict that you have experienced this past week, rather than trying to write that story in your mind and figure out the answer and this and this and that, if the minute that conflict occurred, if you would have just said, okay, Jesus, let me breathe for a second, and I'm going to pray for that person that's involved in this conflict. You ever notice there's two common denominators in every conflict? You and the other person. Most of the time, the conflict is not about you and not the other person. It's about the thing in between. But where do we turn our emotions? Where do we turn our frustration? Where do we start writing these stories? We write it about the person and not the thing. And so the Apostle Paul's going, don't be anxious about anything. When you feel that anxiety, just breathe for a second and pray and say, God, here it is right here. Here's the fourth suggestion, he says, or the fourth admonition. Not only do we not write our own story, we also need to assume the best about the other person. Philippians verse 8, he says this, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Have you heard that verse this morning? That's the one the kids wrote there. Can you imagine what a beautiful family they would live in if every one of those kids not only memorized that verse, but they took it to heart? And today when they go home and they're watching TV and their sibling comes over and tries to take the remote control out of their hand, the first thing they did was just assume the best about their other sibling. They started thinking about what was noble, what is right, instead of just tearing into them like they normally do when conflict, something like that occurs. Can you imagine if when their mom and dad asked them to do something tonight and they'd like much rather stay up late and do something else, they thought, let me think the best about my mom and dad. They're noble, they're good, they're pure, they're lovely, they're admirable. I know it's hard for you to imagine this, okay, because that's so foreign from what kids do, but can you imagine what a change that would make in their life? You're like, yeah, let's teach those kids that. If we would teach kids that way, wouldn't it make sense that we would live that way? So we need to train ourselves. When it comes to conflict, we need to train ourselves that when another person says something we don't like, when they respond in a way that you don't appreciate, when they have a tone that you don't like, what you do instead of just ready to fight back with them is that we assume the best about them. I mentioned earlier that the first few years of my marriage, I just somehow in my mind, I thought Denise is the enemy. And so anytime something came up, I'm like, why are you doing that? Why do you say it that way? Why would you do it that way? And I finally had to breathe and think, my wife would never maliciously try to hurt me. My wife would never just harshly say something to hurt my feelings. And when I began to take a step back, and no matter what came up in our relationship, just going, you know what? I'm going to assume the best about Denise. I'm going to remember that she's noble. I'm going to always remember that she's admirable, that she's lovely, that she's true, that she's pure. All of a sudden, it took my wife off the target, and I had to put on the target what was really going on inside of my heart when there was conflict. That would be the best advice all of us could take. In fact, I want you to think back for a second to the conflict that you had this morning on the way to church, the conflict you had this weekend or this past week. Think back. How would that conflict look different a few minutes later had your first initial response would have been to assume the best about the person? This past week, here's my conflict. Denise and I are supposed to move into our new home Saturday. We're supposed to sign our papers and be real-life living residents that own a home here in the Denver area. And I got the phone call from the lender on Monday. He said, I've got a problem. The people that's loaning the money, they've declined your loan. We're 5 days away, 6 days, 8 days away from moving in about something that they should have figured out 2 months ago so we could have figured out the solution to our problem. I get on the phone, and I wasn't thinking what was admirable about that lender. I wasn't thinking good, noble thoughts about that lender. This was one of those conversations I'm going, I'm trying to remember, did I write occupation? Did I have to fill in the occupation on the loan there? But I didn't lead by thinking the best of what was taking place. Now, you know the good story about this? They ended up not lending the money. My realtor got involved, and I'm just praying, God, help me not to be anxious. I'm preaching this, okay? I'm having to study this. I'm having to tell people about this. Help me to, and I'm not living a very good God, but help me live it better than I'm doing right now. Let me be anxious about nothing, but in everything be in prayer and supplication. So we got declined on Monday for the loan of the house that we're supposed to close on Friday. If you think we had conflict, I might have told you we're living with the Kyles right now, and they're going to have conflict going, I thought it was only going to be for 2 weeks. We can't have you in here longer than that. They're probably having real conflict. Be anxious about nothing. Be everything in prayer and supplication. I get back on the phone with the lender going, really, you should have done this. You should have done this. Are you just incompetency? What's going on? And everything be in prayer and supplication. My realtor gets on the phone. She calls another lender. Within 3 days, she found us another lender. They closed the loan in 2 days with a 0.5% interest rate lower than what we had. Now, you really want to see how God works? And he said, you're supposed to bring this much money to the table. You only have to bring this much money to the table. My wife's going, more furniture, more furniture, more furniture. So she's believing in God all in this thing. But watch this. I had to, and I didn't do a good job assuming the best. And here's what I know. I left some people in the wake of my not trusting God. And I wonder, the reason Paul wrote this letter, he's going, can you get with these two ladies? Can you get with Erdia and Sintich? I don't want them to be left in the wake. I don't want the name of Jesus to be left in the wake of what's going on. And so that's the reason Paul's going, you need to assume the best. Think on what's right. And here's the last one. I close with this one. We need to listen, validate, and propose a solution. Listen, validate, and propose a solution. I am afraid in our society that we live in that we have lost the art of learning to listen and learning to validate. We've lost the art of learning to listen because so much of stuff, what we do is on social media, texting, and you don't have to listen to somebody. You can just shoot off what you want to, and you can just send it out there. But we've also, in our society, developed this thing called cancel culture. If you don't look, think, or feel the way I think you should, then you're no more to me. And we need to get back. And I think as followers of Jesus, we begin the reissuing and redirecting our society, going, it is okay for you to feel different than I feel. I don't have to cancel you out because you feel different. You can think different than I think. I don't have to cancel you out. Remember, it's about unity and not uniformity. And so we need to learn back and go back in our conflict and listen to people, not just listen to the words they're saying out of their mouth, but listen to what they're saying and listen to what they're feeling. Listen to what they're going through before they ever open their mouth to even tell you what they're thinking. That's the art of listening. But to validate them going, I may not agree with you, and we may still stand on different sides of the issue, but I can still validate how you feel about a certain situation or about a certain area in your life. Listen, validate, and then propose a solution. Here's what the Apostle Paul said. He said in Philippians chapter 4, verse 9, whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, he said this, put it into practice. That's proposing a solution. He's going, listen, all this sounds really good, but if it's all just kind of spiritual stuff up here, but you don't put it into your life on Monday and you don't propose a solution for the conflict, it stays nothing up here besides spiritual knowledge. He goes, you need to propose a solution. You put it into practice. And then he said this, and the God of peace will be with you. Notice he says, and the God of peace will be with you after the conflict is done the godly way. He's not saying run from conflict. He's saying deal with conflict, but you deal with it from a spiritual, healthy, godly way, and the God of peace will be with you. I told you, I think as Paul's writing this last part of this letter, he said, yeah, for sure, let's deal with the conflict. And I don't think he's saying all these 5 things are specific to conflict, but isn't it amazing how they lay on to conflict? And if we approach relationships the way that he's giving us advice, it will lead us to peace. I want to conclude today with one statement, kind of a statement for you to think about. And it says this, your joy will not be found in your knowledge, but it will be found in your reconciliation. Today's sermon is one of those sermons that, to me, it lands in the head, okay? It's giving you some things to think about, some things to use as a filter to run some relationships and some conflict you may be having through, and it kind of lands there. And for many, it lands there, and you're taking the notes, like, yeah, that makes sense, that sounds good, and you fold that up, and you stick in your Bible, or you put in your pocket or your purse, and you take home later. That's nothing more than knowledge. And knowledge will never bring joy. It is not until we take the knowledge and we actually apply it to the conflict we're having that's where the real joy comes from. And so my challenge to all of us this week is, as you think about relationships that you're in and you encounter throughout the week, use this as a filter going, God, as I hit conflict, am I dealing with conflict your way? And when we deal it with his way, biblical way, it will bring us greater joy in our life. Think about this. As we get in this few minutes, we're going to take communion together. Isn't that what Jesus' death on the cross was all about? There was a conflict, and the conflict was between us and God. We sinned, and God's not sinned. He's pure, and we're not. And so it created a chasm. It created a distance between us and God. Now, God could have been like the super spiritual knowledgeable one. Well, if you'd done it this way, if you'd done it this way, and you hadn't done that, and you hadn't done that, and kind of sit back going, yeah, that should have made this whole thing a whole lot better, and we'd be experiencing a whole lot more joy than you are right now. Yet God wasn't willing for it just simply to be knowledge. God says, no, we're going to think, we're going to talk. He says, I'm going to bring about reconciliation. And the Bible says that he sent his own son, Jesus, to die on the cross for our sins. That was where the reconciliation took place. It's like God said, I will take the first step. I will move to you even though you're not moving to me. So wouldn't it make sense in our lives when we have broken relationships with people, if God took the first step to reconcile with us, wouldn't it make sense that we take the first step to reconcile with others? And so every week we come together and we take communion